But we also see a lot of problems already within those trials. Most of the trials today, they start the trials, but having not met their recruitment goals. So the vast majority, they envision to have maybe 500 patients in the treatment group or in the control group. Yeah, but they at the start of the trial, they have not been able yet to recruit all of them. Yeah, so that's a normal thing. And then also a normal thing within those clinical trials today is that quite a big share of those recruited patients, they don't stay. Yeah, they don't stay until the end of the clinical trial, and re-recruiting replacement, yeah, that's quite an expensive thing to do. And last but not least, another thing, yeah, which also made us look into this segment of the digital health market is the fact that more and more investors are looking into it, yeah, and maybe they see that digital therapeutic tools are a good way of monetizing within clinical trials, and lots of money has been poured into this the vendor landscape with big shots of a few hundred millions of investments into that market. Yeah. So that all raised our interest, and hopefully that's also the fact for you guys sitting there at the computer at the moment. But I would now like to hand over to Isabel, yeah, to give us a quick intro in what you have found when you did this research project on the graph.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rolf, and thanks everyone for being here. Let me go ahead and share a few brief slides to introduce this topic. Great. So as Ralph mentioned, today we will be discussing the landscape and the changing landscape of decentralized clinical trial solutions. And when we speak about decentralized clinical trials, it's a bit of an umbrella term to address new ways of doing clinical trials that are now conducted in part virtually or sometimes completely virtually, which allows the patients and the providers to do this from the comfort of their own home instead of from a traditional trial site. So this is something to keep in mind as we move through the panel discussion today. So let's take a look at the traditional ways in which clinical trials had been. So I think that many of us are aware of the fact that there were many issues in running clinical trials, and it was causing lots of problems in terms of, first of all, the budget of the clinical trials running over time, patients dropping out. So one number that we see that's sort of commonly thrown around in the industry is that 80% of clinical trials in the US are actually delayed by at least a month or even stopped because there's problems reaching initial recruitment goals. So they just can't get enough patients to join the clinical trial. And this is because in the US, about 70% of patients live more than 2 hours away from trial sites. So we know that oftentimes the same trial sites are being used over and over again. It's the same large universities and research hospitals, and it doesn't allow patients that live far away or live maybe in rural areas to participate. So given this and other burdens to participation, actually 30% of patients drop out of clinical trials. And when they do this, it causes massive problems on the budget side, so that on average, it costs almost $20,000 to replace a patient during a clinical trial. Even though this varies, of course, from trial to trial, it's about 3 times more than the cost of actually recruiting a patient. So trials are very much incentivized to keep patients as long as possible, and at the same time have a lot of difficulty with this. So given these problems, it's not surprising that we're seeing an increase in the number of clinical trials that are conducted virtually. So this simple graph just shows the number of clinical trials that have some element of decentralization on the y-axis against time. And as we can see in 2020, there was about 1,000 clinical trials in North America and Europe that were conducted with some kind of element of decentralization, at least in part virtually. And given that there's 13,000 trials going on, that's almost 10%. But what we can see and what we project in 2026 is that we will have up to 6,000 trials that are conducted in part virtually, and that's going to be almost 1 in 3 clinical trials. So we expect that this is going to be a huge paradigm shift in clinical research. So what are some of the actual ways in which these virtual trials are done? So what we're seeing here is just a a simplified view of the different clinical trial activities, from study design all the way over to data analysis and reporting. And I just wanted to bold a few of the alternatives that decentralized and digital tools are allowing to take place virtually. In the interest of time, I won't talk about all of them, but some of the interesting ones, for example, are in site selection and patient recruitment. We see that digital tools can massively improve the way that patients are being recruited. So if the traditional way of recruiting a patient was maybe even a physical flyer or speaking directly with their general practitioner, now we can have massive social media campaigns on Facebook or Google Ads or Instagram or something like this that can actually reach the right patient groups. We also see that real-world data is used to actually identify where the patients are located and use this to actually optimize where the physical sites are. In terms of patient onboarding, this is another large opportunity for digital tools, because we see that this can be done with some kind of like online education, or telehealth can be used to actually present the education and the e-consent for the patient to be consenting into the clinical trial. The same is the case with data collection, where we can use virtual tools such as mobile apps to keep track of the patient-reported outcomes, or wearables can also keep track of outcomes as well. And this is a much more efficient way than the traditional sort of pen and paper recording, in which the patients would maybe have to write down what their symptoms were and then go into the trial and actually report it maybe often weeks later. Maybe they had forgotten what their symptoms were when they took the medication. And this kind of ensures a higher level of data quality, while at the same time, for data monitoring, it's a much more efficient way for sites and for the trial sponsors and for the patients themselves to all have access to the same platform in real time. So there's definitely a lot of benefits that are being shown in terms of efficiency and data quality. So who are these players that are actually allowing this decentralized market to move forward? So at Research to Guidance, as Ralph mentioned, we have run a pretty extensive market study, and we found that there's 6 different groups of providers, or 6 different archetypes that we have called them, that are providing services across the clinical trial value chain for clinical trial sponsors. So the first of these is the real-world data providers, or what we've called the data repositories, and they specialize in providing real-world data sources for trial sponsors to have a better understanding of how their drugs are performing in the real world, and have a better understanding of who the patients are that are most affected by these conditions. And these are the most helpful, primarily in site selection and recruitment. Then we have our patient engagement specialists, and oftentimes these are some kind of software or tech solution that allows for the patient engagement long-term throughout. And this can be done via the use of coaching or via a mobile app, some kind of software solution, or telehealth. Then we have the data capture services, which are longtime players in the market, and they're essentially the solutions that allows for the data to be taken from the patient and then stored in some kind of database and displayed to all of the active stakeholders in the clinical trial. Then we have supply chain managers, which are the logistics coordinators, and these are a rather smaller subsegment of the market that are focused entirely taking of having to send, of course, all of the medication instead of to a trial site to the actual homes of the patients that are participating. And then finally, we have the end-to-end solution providers, and these are the DCT companies that are providing services across the value chain, all the way through from study design to data analysis and drug and device supply, and oftentimes filling in gaps in their service offering via partnering with smaller, more niche providers shown on the chart. And then last but not the least, we have what we've called the digitizing incumbents, which are the CROs that have long time been in the market providing services for clinical trials, for traditional clinical trials, which now, in the case of COVID and in the case of the rapidly digitizing world, are now a bit scrambling to add decentralized services to their portfolio. And they're doing this mostly either the acquisition of smaller companies or directly partnering with, for example, end-to-end solution providers. So we can see it's a very segmented market, but it's also very dynamic as well, as many of the players are interacting with each other, partnering, acquiring, and it's more of a co-opetition market at this point. Something that we have not spoken about, but it's our focus for today, so I wanted to briefly mention it, is the role of digital therapeutics in this overall market. So we see at Research to Guidance that there's two potential roles that digital therapeutics can play in the DCT market. The first and the most important is digital therapeutics as trial sponsors. So as we see that digital therapeutics is a rapidly growing market, they will have to start running clinical trials so that they can show that their solution works, so that they can reach some kind of reimbursement or regulatory status, and to differentiate themselves from competitors. So we're already seeing some interesting examples of this happening in the market. Like, for example, shown here, we have Click Therapeutics, which is a pretty well-known digital therapeutic that they have recently partnered with the end-to-end provider from Google, Verily, to run an entirely decentralized clinical trial on their digital therapeutic for depression. And this has received some media attention. We expect that there will be more large trials like this in the future. Then something that is a bit more of a future view, but is also quite likely, is that digital therapeutic companies will actually become providers and start to offer a service offering in this market. And what I mean by this is that digital therapeutics hold a wealth of patient data and patient outcome data, specifically because many times the patients are tracking their day-to-day outcomes, maybe their pain levels or what they've eaten or their activity. And this is all real-world data that can later on be used to support clinical trials in terms of the patient recruitment that I had mentioned, or post-market safety studies. And many times digital therapeutics companies, they really know best how to digitally keep a patient engaged, and they have great platforms with high user retention rates. And so these kinds of platforms can actually engaged during a clinical trial. And this is what we're seeing today in a few examples, but the most prominent one probably being Belong Life, which is a digital therapeutic solution for cancer, among other things. And IQVIA, one of the largest CROs on the market, has recently purchased their solution for the long-term patient engagement in clinical trials. So we could expect that this is a trend that will become more popular in the future. And as this market continues to grow, we expect that it will reach over $9 billion by 2026. So we understand that this market is growing, and there's certainly a lot of opportunities for market players. Great. So just to leave us, I guess, on a positive note, what are some of these claims that these decentralized clinical trial solution providers are claiming, and why have they been so successful? So one of the main ones, as I have mentioned, is faster patient recruitment. So using data mining and EHR tools, we can better identify patients for clinical trials, especially true in the case of rare diseases where there might not be so many patients available to join a clinical trial. We see that there's higher data quality because now we have instant data upload and more data that's actually being captured from the sensors and from the patient-reported outcomes. And potentially it's a higher quality and less transcription errors than a patient recording it with a pencil and a piece of paper. We see better patient retention because patients can be engaged with gamification tools or reminders, digital coaching, and because they're potentially less likely to drop out if they don't have to, go into the site every day. We see improved rates of patient adherence to medication. So as we understand, at least in the case of potentially a pharma clinical trial, the data is severely discredited if the patients aren't correctly taking their medication. So we see some companies and some solutions that are actually able to track the adherence to the medication with potentially taking pictures of the patients when they take the medication, and there's less room for false patient-reported data. We see, very importantly, an increase in patient diversity because once you remove barriers such as lacking transportation to a trial site, more patients can participate despite their location, despite a disability that they may have, despite a chronic condition that they may have, or other socioeconomic factors. And then finally, all of these together come up with a reduction in the time and cost. So the clinical trials can be conducted faster with less delays and ultimately reducing the overhead budget. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and then I will hand it over now to my next speaker. Excuse me.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. Thanks for this great introduction. maybe quickly hand over to Marcus. Marcus from USense Lab, providing my green digital solution. I think last year or this year you got listed on the DIGA, on the German digital health app directory, allowing you to get a prescription by statutory health insurance companies. And the special thing about your company, and potentially also about your organization, is that you have conducted a clinical trial all by yourself, and it was all virtual. But I leave it now to you to explain what you have done.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. I hope you can hear me and can see the first slide well.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to talk about both sides, the digital therapeutic side and how it is linked to virtual clinical trials or decentralized clinical trials, and why, as you said, Ralph, we have done it all by ourselves, because we really believe that these two things belong together. So in my first impulse here for the first slides, I really want to show you how we want to also use decentralized trials in the future and why we're doing it by ourselves. And then I'm also, of course, happy to tell you a bit more insights how we have done it in the very first time. Briefly to my background, I'm a co-founder and the CEO of USense Lab, and I'm coming from basic research. I'm a trained research scientist, and as such, as a former research scientist, I'm still today very much motivated and inspired by translational medicine, so taking cutting-edge research and turning it into products. But of course, we are not in the space to have just products. But the actual ultimate goal is we have a sense that believe in precision medicine, and whether you call it the right treatment to the right patient at the right time or a bit shorter, the best treatment as the first line treatment. The fact is that currently we are not yet there. The reality is that people feel more like in a labyrinth. And even if you are treated by medical guidelines, the first treatment usually is taken from a set of standard treatments, and then stepwise you get to the treatment which is actually effective for you. In a world where at some point we would have a predictive biomarker, kind of a digital companion diagnostics, where for each, let's say, classical drug, we would know whether a treatment is effective, or maybe even more important, whether it is not effective, so you could actually skip this maybe first line treatment and get directly to another one. Or maybe you have a software which tells you what is the dosage of the treatment, or what is the perfect timing of the treatment, whether you should take it in the morning or later during the day. So that would be kind of the susceptibility biomarker, or risk biomarker sometimes being called. Or a third one would be where the software is the active ingredient in itself, making it a digital drug, which usually is a precursor to it, is a response biomarker. So in this digital biomarker realm, I think it's a way to digital or the future to precision medicine and digital therapeutics. And there is where I believe we have the highest impact of decentralized trials. And that's why we do it in USense Lab by ourselves. So we have learned to use algorithms for changing patient behavior. This was already mentioned, that it is about adherence and engagement. And we started with a prescription digital therapeutics for treating migraine based on behavioral interventions. And we continuously use real-world data to improve these algorithms. We have also algorithms that inform or maybe even drive clinical decision-making. And again, we use the data which we collect, the real-world data, to improve these algorithms. But at some point, if you really have the claim of a digital biomarker, just real-world data or real-world evidence is not enough. You really need to prove and show that the claim you are doing is really predicting the response of a certain drug, predicting the right time, or is an active ingredient in itself, kind of reprograms the brain. And for this evidence level, you need to go back from the real-world evidence to RCT, the gold standard. And And this has to be done in an integral part and has to be done while the product is already on the market, also not so kind of post-authorization and increasing the level of evidence needed. We have done this actually, so we have a DiGA, a digital healthcare application in the German market, which is also the only DiGA at the moment. I think we have 24 DiGAs, which is approved as a diagnostic tool, so it can distinguish the phenotype between tension-type headaches and migraines, and this is used within the DiGA to inform clinical decision-making. And we will continuously improve the product and validate or doing a clinical validation or performance validation of these algorithms to put them one level up from an algorithm to a digital biomarker. So most of what we are doing in Sense Lab is really for a certain type of diseases. So if we are in other areas like oncology, you may argue differently where decentralized trials become a value, but we argue for chronic disease with episodic manifestations where it is really about long-term monitoring in combination with digital biomarkers. So I think it is really both this therapeutic focus area and digital biomarkers with decentralized trials. We have proven this for migraine. Samson's migraine is the first digital prescription digital therapeutics we have brought to the market. At this moment, we have about 5,000 patients under treatment, and the actual access study has been done in a virtual trial. But as I said, we continue to do this. And by this prologue, let me really briefly, and then we can dive into the details, answer these questions. If you have asked before, what's the difference? The difference, I think it's very clear. We want to have a decentralized version because we need a richer diversity of patients for this heterogeneous patterns we see in the episodic manifestations, whereas actually the digital solution assisting running virtual trials. I would say it goes really both ways. It's not only that the DTX is assisting, and so that we can actually also run clinical trials for other companies, for example, as was suggested by Isabel, but it's actually also going back. The virtual trial is helping the digital therapeutic solution. So I like to quote Stefan Lust, our head of clinical operations. She talks always about a perfect marriage. So the two things really belong together and should not be thought of separately. And the highest value, as I've argued, is in this reverse translation. So this continuous validating algorithms and getting them into digital biomarkers. And the biggest challenge I see for the future is that we really need to think about product lifecycle-based evidence generation or evidence oversight. And I'm deliberately using the wording here from the FDA. When the FDA talks about learning algorithms, they think about artificial intelligence and machine learning-based software as a medical device regulatory oversight. So there it is more the authorization get to the market, and you have to onboard the regulatory requirement into the product. But now if you think about reimbursement, value-based pricing, you need to, in the same manner, onboard the evidence generation. And the evidence generation then is best done in a decentralized version. So by this, I hope to give some impact how we think at Sense Lab about this field. I'm happy to answer questions in the end of the panel.
Thank you, Markus. Very impressive. So you also raised the importance of those two sides coming together, DTX companies and vendors of digital solutions to support clinical trials, to, how you phrase it, to onboard this creation of clinical evidence into the normal process of developing DTX solutions, which I think it's a rather complicated thing to do. But on the other hand, is there another option as of using those digital tools to do that? So let's quickly jump over to Adam. He is one representative of a company which has concentrated on providing these tools and services here to conduct clinical trials hybrid or virtually. Please meet Adam from Curebase. It's a US-based company that also ventures into the European market now. And Adam, maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how you see those tools are supporting clinical trials in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ralph. And thanks everybody for the opportunity to join the session today. As Ralph mentioned, I'm with Curebase. We are a service provider. Just a little background on myself. I will say I'm an operations guy, not a BD guy. So I will really focus in on what the practical kind of applications we've had with our clients around running virtual and decentralized trials, hybrid trials, in particular with a focus on DTX, since that's our topic here today, and also a big kind of area for us that we have a lot of interest in. So prior to joining Curebase about 1.5 years ago, I had spent over 10 years in the clinical research side. I actually started as a clinician and worked at larger CROs, worked in academia for a few years, and was at a large pharmaceutical company when the pandemic hit. And like many of us, I was scrambling to keep my my study that was running in 8 countries and with hundreds of sites up and going, and saw things that were happening in this space to try and basically take the technology that was already there and being used very well in other industries, and how we could start continuing to really apply that to our clinical trials here. So at Curebase, we have basically 3 different ways that we are able to optimize for these type of trials. One, of course, is the software. Software is essential when you're running a decentralized or virtual trial, of course. So, we have the ways to capture data, the eSource, the EDC. From the clinicians, we have ways to capture data from participants through eConsent and ePro and things of this nature. But I always like to say, and my software guys are never here, so I don't have to feel bad. Like, software alone isn't enough, right? You need kind of what we've found is you really need to have someone on that same side that understands the software to be able to deploy it successfully. So we do offer professional services, those that almost align well with like a CRO, right? So project management, data management, site management, monitoring. And we operate what we call a virtual site, meaning that we have coordinators and doctors who actually interact directly with participants. So just a little context around what our role is in these type of studies. I do think that it's really important to keep in mind, and we have a lot of terms, and Isabel already kind of walked through to kind of level set on some of those. So thinking about fully virtual trials, only a very small percentage, what we're seeing here at Curebase and what I'm seeing outside of Curebase even, are ready for this fully virtual model where we are, doing everything remotely. I mean, we're talking maybe 5 to 10% of trials at the most. So much of what we do and much of what we see being done is around the hybrid space. So keeping in mind that, as exciting as it is that we're using these additional technologies, remembering that using and leveraging the existing infrastructure that's there, whether it's just the people or it's also the people in the physical sites, we still need the researchers that have been doing this a long time, right? The doctors and the coordinators. So we try as much as we can to use the hybrid model, making it so that we can give participants the option, if they want to have their blood collected at home one time, or if they want to come into the clinic, if there are certain things that need to be done from a diagnostic perspective and they need to go into the clinic for certain visits. So I think that one thing that we've learned is to really keep a flexible approach in mind when you're designing these type of clinical trials, whether it's for DTX or other indications or other therapies. That way, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get patients who are engaged because they have the ability to use their own devices, and we are meeting them where they are. But they also have the opportunity to interact with highly skilled research folks and institutions that have been doing this for a long time. In terms of the type of studies that we do and where my context comes from on this, so in addition to doing, the typical type of, drug studies and device studies, we've really dove, headfirst into DTX, much like everyone has been saying here. We see this perfect marriage between DTX and these decentralized clinical trials for the obvious reasons, a couple of which I'll dive deep into. We've done, we've either completed or are in progress with at least a dozen studies in the DTX space. And I think that, so kind of diving into what it is about that we've seen that really makes for that great marriage, and how I've seen some of these pain points that I was experiencing in pharma and at CROs kind of melting away as we perfect this model is, you have a digitally delivered treatment, right? So why not have, the ability to do this within a patient's home? I mean, it seems kind of silly to have a participant drive all the way into a clinic just to have a treatment delivered that they're going to kind of self-administer, and they're going to do that in a clinic setting and go home. Honestly, we're actually seeing in our discussions with regulators, and payers even, they like the idea that this is being done in the real world kind of environment. Like, this is where ultimately these treatments are going to be administered to patients in their homes or wherever they choose for them to be. So it really only makes sense that we design our trials in such a way that really mimics what you're going to see in the real world. Integrating the clinical data with the DTX trial data, I think is really something that is powerful and something we haven't mentioned here yet. So analytics is, an area that has been exploding in clinical trials for a long time. Our ability to be able to, in real time, understand what's happening with the participants, what's happening with our clinical trial data is crucial. And being able to pull in and integrate the DTX solution with the clinical trial data platform, and give our clients as well as our operations teams the ability to look at those data in a meaningful way, has really allowed us to optimize recruitment, retention, even things more serious things like safety, when you can be able to see those things in aggregate and make connections. Certainly, we see faster trial participant recruitment, especially when you start talking about things in the rare disease space, where you might have participants that are spread over vast regions. Again, there might be 1 or 2 visits that they need to do in a clinic, but a lot of it we can be doing from home and not necessarily having these patients travel oftentimes very long distances, or trying to enroll 20 sites for 20 patients, basically, which sometimes you see in these type of rare disease trials. Certainly that increased convenience for participants is something that we hear from them as well. We really do like to gather feedback from participants. This is something that's very refreshing to me, being someone who has come from kind of the traditional clinical trial paradigm and world, is to learn, I'm learning from the software side of things, and things like usability research and understanding the participant journey. And I think that we're, as a community, blending the best of both worlds in terms of what's happening with software and what's happening with the clinical operations world.
Adam, maybe I would have a question. And
Please.
Sorry for jumping in.
No, please.
But also, we have because we have also started a bit later. Maybe I would like to ask a question to all the 3, which have already shared their initial thoughts. And I like this term of a perfect marriage between DTX companies and companies like Curebase to supporting each other. But my question is to all of you, whether you see that out of this perfect marriage, there will be a divorce coming up rather sooner than later, because then both parties will see that they are targeting the same, the same company, the same trial sponsor, because DTX companies, they realize that, oh, they have something which is really of great interest for those clinical trial sponsors. And you, from Curebase and the like, you find, oh wow, they are knocking at the same door. So my question to all of you is out of those perfect marriage, is there a divorce showing up rather sooner than later? What do you think, Marcus?
I said it's a perfect marriage. I didn't say it's an easy marriage. We did it all in our company. In this sense, we cannot split apart because it's one company, but we deliberately didn't look for a service provider doing it, because that would be a marriage which could break at some point. But also, as you summarized in the end, it is, of course, very difficult. So it is for us not so easy to do it. And I also mentioned that in certain diseases, it's probably more easy. In others, you need a hybrid approach. And then you could really think about that it is good to have a service provider, because the actual advantage for us is really this onboarding concept. If you really need it for value-based pricing in a continuous collection of evidence as the same. That's why I use this analogy with the FDA. And if you have an algorithm which is onboard learning, you cannot just give it somewhere away. You need to onboard it directly. And this cannot, even from a regulatory point of view, break apart. With the reimbursement, it can, of course, break apart, or maybe at some point it is good to have different providers addressing different questions here. So, but for us, it is really important to have it at the moment united.
I would say, just going off of what Marcus said, that I think we're still many years away from seeing digital therapeutics companies have well-rounded service offerings for decentralized clinical trials, just because immediately the only service that they could immediately provide would be some kind of patient engagement, and we're already seeing that the market is favoring more end-to-end solution providers. So if anything, potentially the more excellent digital therapeutics platforms, they could be licensing out just this one very small aspect of patient engagement, but I don't see that it would be a major threat to companies such as Curebase or end-to-end providers that already have a well-rounded service offering. And especially because digital therapeutics in general, it's an emerging market. Many of these companies are more in the scale-up or growth phase and looking into other business models. And I haven't really seen, besides this one example that I mentioned with Belong Life, I haven't seen much movement of digital therapeutics already looking into clinical trial management.
And it's certainly something that we consider as well. I think that looking to, historically, right, what pharma did with CROs, even large pharma companies ultimately decided it's just not worth it. We're going to outsource things like monitoring, and because you have to be able to quickly scale staff as well, right? It's like you have this new, if you're a platform company and you're going to have multiple DTX, the ability to quickly operationalize and pull together skilled staff to do these type of studies it's quite a lift. But I think we will find companies that have the infrastructure to do that within the DTX company, and we'll see probably a mix.
Mm. And, maybe it's a good time to get you in, Franz Benstetter, professor at the University of Rosenheim, designing those clinical studies. So if you, in the future, if you design those clinical trials, how much would you have to look into the service offering of DTX companies, and how much would you have to look into the service offering of companies like Curebase to then design the clinical studies? So how much would you basically know all those companies and the service offering in order to design a best-in-class clinical study?
Thank you very much for the question, and sorry for being late. I had a valid problem. I think the issue I would like to talk about, or I wanted to talk about, and you summarize it, Ralph, in the question is it has to be a very clear cooperation when evaluating this kind of trials you really have to understand from the beginning what does it need, what exactly is the intervention. And I think there's a huge opportunity in a cooperation, for example, including things like design thinking. I call it the new world of evaluation, accompanying in an agile way the companies to setting up the kind of, call it new solutions. And for this reason, it's not just an evaluation in the end, but you have to be part of the whole program from the beginning. And for this reason, it's perfect, because with this kind of rapid spread of the new forms of healthcare, we can get extended and accumulated data from the point of view for the researcher. We can do shortened and more effective clinical trials. And therefore, I believe we have a win-win situation between business development and the evaluation. Because with the new data, with the better data, I believe we can use really the power of the data, and we can also use, let's say, a better statistics for an outcome. For this reason, coming back to the main question, I believe working together from the very beginning, evaluation and setting up, let's say, of the new program, including DTX, is the key for agile and for new ways of healthcare forms.
Okay, so it's not either or, it's basically bringing them all together and then forming a well-designed clinical study. Let me conclude and come to the last question to all of you. In 2 to 3 years from now, where do we are? Will it be a normal thing yet to conduct clinical trials in a hybrid mode, or will it be still an exception? What do you think? Maybe starting with you, Adam.
Sure. Yeah, I think that increasingly we will see the hybrid model being used. I see it as a spectrum, right? You know, you might have some that are very much still requiring a lot of in-clinic, whether that's in oncology or other therapeutic areas that require a lot of kind of in-clinic visits, but there's more and more that we can do from home. So I think that increasingly we will see hybrid being used, and that over time that will just be reinforced.
Marcus, how about you? How do you envision the next 2 to 3 years and the next clinical trials you conduct, all hybrid or virtual?
I mean, 2 to 3 years is probably really too short a time period. So we will see a more dramatic change, probably more in 5 to 10 years. Whether it's hybrid or not, it really depends. I mean, there are diseases where you need to draw a blood example, and then it doesn't really make sense at the moment, at least. Maybe we increase there as well. To have it fully digital. But in the migrant space, it makes a lot of sense. In many other disease areas, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that we will see from DECENTRALIZED, but also other companies, the next trials where we have validated algorithms. And then it all depends whether we accept real-world evidence for reimbursement. Then maybe there's not such a pressing need. But if we want to have really RCT evidence, if we want to have causality, there will be more need for having really RCT trials, and then we will see more of these virtual clinical trials in the mode we are doing it at the moment. And I guess this will not change. I think we will actually not completely rely on real-world evidence alone. And in this sense, why I think really in 5 to 10 years, we see much, much more of this.
Yeah, Franz, do you also agree to this? Is it also your perspective?
I also believe we will go definitely more and more into virtual clinical trials. And as mentioned before, it also has a big advantage because we can also better see the patient environment, the stakeholders' interactions. So we have a lot of more opportunities in this kind of virtual clinical trials than in the status quo as we have it right now.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yeah, as everyone has already mentioned, I see it highly unlikely that we'll see many virtual trials entirely virtual trials beyond just the case of digital therapeutics, and the majority of the trials will be more taking a hybrid approach. And in terms of the market, since this is what I had spoken about before, I would see that, now we're in an interesting time because COVID provided a large opportunity for many niche players. But I think in the next few years, we're going to continue to see consolidation so that the CROs are likely going to acquire capabilities for decentralized clinical trials, either with partnership or acquisition of companies. And we will likely see that the largest players will remain the largest players in terms of the outsourced clinical trial research activities market.
Okay, well, I think, for some at least in this panel, that's maybe a rose future. I would like to thank all of you for this very interesting discussion, and also your initial thoughts about this very interesting topic. I know that the time was really limited, and I will definitely talk with the Giant Health team here to carve out a bit more time here to talk about this in more length next year. It is a topic which will stay, I'm pretty sure about that. And if we look at the digital health market overall, this is a segment where we actually see that real money is being made and will be made in the future. So with that, I hope the audience has gained some insights from our discussion. I think there is a recording, so when you have missed this session, you have a second chance to look at it. With that, thanks again for all the panelists, and I would now like to hand over to the Giant team to lead us to the next session. Thanks a lot again. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.